Welcome to the Coroner's Report, Episode 5 of Miss Maybelline, the Pied Piper, and a Clown Named Hobby. Before we begin, please remember this is a true crime podcast with adult themes. Please be aware when possible the actual person's voice is in this podcast. However, several witnesses are deceased. Some chose not to be recorded and still others agreed for their words to be used, but not their real names. Please remember to like and follow us on all social media platforms. All suspects or persons of interest mentioned are considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law.
Good evening, Tracy.
Remember how we told you that Danny King left us messages on Facebook Messenger?
When Evelyn rewrote her will, and she's the one that wanted to rewrite it, I didn't tell her to, she sit me down and asked me what I thought. And I said, well, leave everything to Preston. And she said, well, I've got to leave something to the girls. And she said, I don't have to leave anything to my son. He already has a few $1 million. I said, well, you've got to leave him something, so leave him the El Dorado. And so weird back in the day. So Preston actually was the major beneficiary. I heard he died recently, and I was real sad to hear that.
Welcome back to the Coroner's Report. My name is Steve Navoychek, and I'm a retired coroner of two of the largest counties in Arkansas and a former state crime lab director. Along with my partners, Tracy Carrington and Carla Bozeman, I've been reviewing some of my old cases. And this case, what a wild ride we've been on with Miss Maybelline. Evelyn Williams married into the family that started the company. She married 2 more times and ended up in Hot Springs, Arkansas, flipping a skating rink into a dinner club with the help of her friend, Danny King. But sadly, Evelyn Williams lost her life in a house fire. Our review indicates the fire was in fact an arson. There were multiple points of origin. Additionally, it was corroborated it was not a kitchen fire as the chicken would have been charred. It was not. Lastly, Miss Williams was found in a supine position, which, according to all of the firefighters with whom we spoke, rarely, if ever, happens as the victim is usually low, trying to get under the smoke and will fall forward, or is found in a fetal position trying to cover their face. This would indicate Miss Williams was either unconscious or dead when the fire was set. Only a visual autopsy was performed at the crime lab. Now we will start addressing all the different suspects and the aftermath of the fire, trying to determine who did it. Of course, sometimes there really are no answers, but that doesn't mean we stop asking the questions. No, we never stop asking the questions.
The Arkansas State Police interview took place on March 8th. 5 days after the fire, and they were given permission to return to the house by the probate judge on March 30th. So where did that soot on Steve Wyatt's cowboy hat really come from?
Additionally, a hair and beard sample were taken from Wyatt. It should be noted that Danny King was not mentioned as present during this interview, yet the note states a hair sample was taken from King.
And like a lot of the evidence in this case, those samples were not found during our intensive search. No reports, no evidence, no transcriptions, no samples, nothing. But over the years, Steve Wyatt remembered some things that just didn't really add up. Things that make you go, See, the day after the fire, Steve Wyatt stumbled across one of the more perplexing clues in this case.
The day after the fire, we were at the club. The toilet in the bathroom was running. And so I looked at the lid, and I found a wallet in there. The wallet belonged to a young man. I gave the wallet to Danny, and Danny quickly stuck it in his coat pocket and told me not to say anything about it. And I always wondered, what was that about? I just remember because, it was all wet, and I opened it up, and there was a driver's license. But I gave it to Danny, and Danny was very upset about that wallet. The only person that could have put it in there was Danny. That was his office there. So why would he do that and tell me not to say anything? And hearing some rumors about some kid being dumped in the lake, what if he was one of the people that started the fire, was involved in that? Get rid of, a witness.
Steve Wyatt mentioned the Goon Squad may have been involved. Remember, the Goon Squad was just a bunch of teenage boys that Danny had met at the skating rink. There were rumors at the time that some petty theft and burglaries were being carried out by some of these boys, and some of those boys did end up leading a life of crime.
Steve Wyatt never reported the soggy wallet or the missing boy to the police. We even checked the newspaper looking for a missing boy or a body found in the lake. There was nothing reported.
Of course, this story was never in Danny's book, and we're only relying on Steve Wyatt's memories.
Interestingly, Danny had to petition the court to remove items from the crime scene. His attorney filed an affidavit 3 weeks after the fire, and some of the items listed sounded like they were more like Evelyn's property than Danny's. There's an original large Thomas Paine oil painting, all the furniture from his basement apartment. Now remember, that apartment was furnished when he moved in. The list included a blue velvet couch, swag lamp, TVs, stereos, a ship lantern light fixture from the front of the house, a dinner bell located on the back terrace, and plaster busts.
We can't say for certain those weren't Danny's items, but the family certainly had questions. Of course, at the time, it simply wasn't worth the fight. They were in shock because no one expects your 77-year-old mother or grandmother to die in a fire.
The family was still searching for answers and were stunned when they arrived and found the house wasn't secured. The family was concerned about some missing jewelry, and Arkansas State Police investigator Hendershot remembers today how he was able to recover something special for the family.
On the dresser in her bedroom was a big glob of melted plastic. I was bagging stuff up, and I bagged it up and marked it evidence, and I put all this in my trunk, and I'd forgotten about it. They called me one day and asked if I would meet the family at the police department in Hot Springs, and I said, sure. So I drove over there, and I'm waiting on them, and they come in, and they said that they had been to the house and looked through stuff and said they were missing an extremely valuable piece of jewelry. She had a watch that was the band and the watch and everything was made out of 2-carat baguette diamonds that made the entire band of a watch. Then the whole case for the watch and everything was big, huge diamonds all over it. I mean, it was enough diamonds in there to retire on. She had the watch taken out and a blue stone put in there, and she wore that big diamond as a bracelet and said, did you see anything like that? And I said, no. And they said, somebody must have stole it. Well, wait a minute. Let me check something. So I went out to the car and popped the trunk. Over in the corner of my trunk over was this plastic bag with this glob of molten plastic in it. And I took it in and I laid it down there, and I said, this is the only thing I saw anywhere. The guy pulls out the jeweler's loop and he's looking at it, and there was one little corner of a stone sticking out there, and he looked at it and nodded yes.
From the newspaper articles about the fire, we see that the rumors ran through the community. 3 different suspects or groups of suspects emerged, from the Dixie Mafia to her ex-husband Hobby Derrick to her best friend and business partner Danny King. Fingers pointed in every direction. But the best way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time, so first up, let's dig in and look hard at the ever-elusive but always talked about Dixie Mafia.
Mark Lawrence, who was just a kid at the skating rink, recalls Hot Springs had been a mafia-run town just 10 years prior. Perhaps those same men set fire to kill out the competition.
Hot Springs is a bad place. Mafia, mafia, mafia. They never found a cause, but did you think they were going to back in those days? It was all bad people here. I mean, going way back when Capone was here, but you know, it was just mafia, 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 and people feared for their lives in this town.
However, David Hendershot, an investigator for the Arkansas State Police, scoffed at that idea.
I have been a police officer for 40-something years, and I have worked major case unit in Memphis, Tennessee, along with the Memphis Police Department. I've worked undercover for 20 years. I've been on all over the United States, and there ain't a whole lot I ain't done or seen. And I have heard about the Dixie Mafia my whole career. And supposedly it was run by a criminal named Carlos Marcellus out of New Orleans, Louisiana. And there is a crook named Carlos Marcellus that used to live in New Orleans, and he was a bad guy. What it is it's these good old redneck boys out here that want to be somebody to show you how tough they are and how badass they are. They say they're with the Dixie Mafia. Well, there is no Dixie Mafia. If you get 3 or 4 guys out here together and they start going out here and robbing places and working together, then yeah, they got a little organized crime ring going. But as far as having a mafia where there's a dom and lieutenants and captains and all this other kind of stuff, that's bullshit. I've never met one, and I've sent more people to the penitentiary than you can shake a stick at. and I've interviewed every badass there is, and there is no Dixie Mafia. It's just some redneck out here that's trying to impress his girlfriend or somebody else.
Well, that certainly makes sense to me, but this is Hot Springs, small town America. Gossip spread through the town that a rival club owner, who may or may not have had ties to the mafia, set the house on fire with the intent to scare Evelyn into not opening the dinner theater. However, the dinner theater was already open, so that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The most popular club at the time was the Vapors, run by a man named Dane Harris. Norman Jones, who owned the nightclub Norma Christie, didn't believe the mafia link either.
I don't think Dane Harris would have been jealous of anything that small.
Rick Warren, the musical director and show producer at the Palace, agreed Dane Harris simply wasn't interested.
Number one, the police and the sheriff's department all asked me the same question. Because they thought if anybody would know, I would know. She was no threat to them. He has the Vapors, a multi-million-dollar supper club. He had all the money he needed. He didn't need anything from the palace. If the man had so much money, what the hell would he want to do with a palace?
Our own fire investigator, who believes strongly this was a clear case of arson, did not see evidence in the fire marshal report that this was some sort of professional hit.
If it was the mafia, they would do a little better job than that. If that was my mafia man doing the hit, I'd put out a hit on him because I wouldn't want him doing my work.
The next suspect was the ex-husband and failed con man extraordinaire, Hobby Derrick. But by this time, Hobby and his stepdaughter/ex-wife, Delisle, they had moved on to Fayetteville, located about 4 hours away from Hot Springs. They had, by all accounts, never looked back. Delisle was working for the state and had recently won a prestigious award for her work in clean water. There's no mention in the police, court records, or even the newspapers of Hobby Derrick ever returning to Hot Springs or harassing his ex-wife in any way except perhaps in the mind of Danny King. So that just leaves Danny King, the Pied Piper. But why would he have killed the goose that quite literally was laying the golden egg? There are a couple of items in the police file that really stand out.
In the police file, there's a copy of the 8-page handwritten letter by Gloria Rosen. Gloria was the longtime girlfriend of Bill Williams, who was Evelyn's only child. Gloria and Bill rushed to Hot Springs when they received word of the fire, and they were staying at the same hotel as Danny. This letter was written on hotel stationery and contemporary to the time. The letter was addressed to Arkansas State Police investigator Sergeant Mike Fletcher.
In the past 2 months, Mrs. Williams discussed with me a change in the will to help her son. Danny told me that he was aware that she was about to change the will and said so on the telephone. Please understand that Mr. Williams did not even want her estate, as it would have put him in a higher tax bracket. Danny knew all this, and I believe he was afraid he would be cut out completely, because I also believe he was aware of the contents of the will. All I can say is that Danny moved to Hot Springs less than 2 years ago, and this will was written about 2 months after he arrived. Since that time, she's acted very erratically. And remember, it was Danny who introduced her to Hobby Derrick in the first place. Danny was her hairdresser in California.
Remember when I told you that Danny left us that long voice message on Facebook after the second episode dropped?
When Evelyn rewrote her will, and she's the one that wanted to rewrite it, I didn't tell her to, she would sit me down and ask me what I thought. And I said, well, leave everything to Preston. And she said, well, I've got to leave something to the girls. And she said, I don't have to leave anything to my son. He's already has a few $1 million. I said, well, you've got to leave him something. So leave him the Eldorado. And so weird back in the day. So Preston actually was the major beneficiary. I heard he died recently, and I was real sad to hear that.
If you like the Coroner's Report and the programming we're providing, please remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so we can keep providing quality programming. Like and subscribe today. Gloria, she wasn't the only person who thought Danny or his lover had something to do with Evelyn's death. The rumor mill was churning away in Hot Springs. The kids from the skating rink, Mark and Debbie, strongly believed something sinister happened on that day at the Maybelline Manor.
She was old. She couldn't hardly breathe as it was. She didn't walk that much. I don't know if Danny done it or Steve done it because he was so jealous of Danny.
She was restricting his abilities to run totally wild and amok. Miss Maybelline was not stupid. She was old, but she wasn't stupid. I think it didn't take her long to catch on to what he was doing, but she was one of those people that was old and had nobody here, and he kind of made himself that person. I think he did every bit of it. I think she was on to him, or she was out of money. I think he could get nothing else out of her, and he thought maybe I could get insurance money. Yeah, I think he did every bit of it.
There's another interview noted in the police file that raised an eyebrow. The Arkansas State Police interviewed Gary Arthur Wilson twice. In his first interview on March 9th, he said some shocking things.
I've known Danny King since September of 1977. I know he's a homosexual. He had tried to pick me up a couple times. Around Christmas of 1977, Randy Smith, who worked for the telephone company at the time, we were in a Peacock Lounge on Central Avenue. The name is Norma Christie's now. It was after 9 p.m. We had been there for 30 to 40 minutes. Danny came in and he had 2 young white males with him. There was a white male approximately 5 feet tall, very well built. I think his name was Rocky. He was dancing downstairs when Danny arrived. Danny King was standing at the bar next to me, and Rocky was sitting at the bar stool next to me and Danny. And Danny was standing between Rocky and I. I overheard Danny King tell Rocky something to the effect of, "I'll make it worth your while to help me get rid of a problem." Rock said, "What are you talking about?" Danny said about $5,000 to get rid of Evelyn. At that point, Randy and I got up and danced or we left. I have not seen Rocky since then. There's no doubt in my mind what I heard Danny King tell Rocky.
But just 47 days later, while Gary Arthur Wilson was serving time for burglary in the state penitentiary, he recanted what he had told police earlier. Why would he do that? Sadly, when we tracked down Randy Smith, we learned he had passed away. But some of Randy's friends told us he had recounted the same story to them several times. Gary Arthur Wilson is also deceased.
So what was the motive? Who stood to gain from Miss Maybelline's death? In her will, Evelyn bequeaths $5,000 cash payments to 2 of Hobby Derrick's brothers, her 2 sisters and her California seamstress, Evie Day. She leaves $15,000 in cash to Danny King, along with 25% of the value of the skating rink. She leaves her house and 75% of the skating rink to her grandson, her Cadillac to her son Bill, and the rest to her 3 granddaughters and grandson. Steve Wyatt remembers.
She had just written a new will just days before the fire. She had cut a number of people out, like Hobby's brothers, and she had her sister in the will, but her sister, Bunny, down in Florida, had married a millionaire, so she didn't need any money or help. So Evelyn was taking her out of the will. I know she was going into town to write up a new will. Bill knew there was a new will and resisted on having it registered. It would have changed a lot of things. You know, I'm under the impression, though, just by things that Danny insinuated, that Evelyn was tired of him. The gravy train might be over.
And there was more. See, Evelyn believed in safe investments. She was, after all, a survivor of the Great Depression. Evelyn might not have been touched by the Great Depression, but no doubt she had witnessed what life was like without money, and she wasn't about to make risky investments. Her granddaughter Sherry told us that living through the Depression was why Evelyn hid money and didn't trust banks.
Evelyn, like so many in her generation, believed in nice, safe bonds. And we do have evidence that she had bonds in that house.
I went back out there and did a crime scene. When I went in there, I remember looking in the drawers, and there were just all kinds of savings bonds just piled up, $20,000 ones just everywhere. And there was, in the closet was full of mink stoles and ermine and all this other kind of coats and stuff that had been all smoke damage and everything.
So we know there were bonds in the house. We don't know what kind of bonds they were. Savings bonds are low yield, but if she were a savvy investor, they would be treasury bonds, notes, or bills. And Steve Wyatt adds even more to the story.
See, according to Steve Wyatt, a few months before the fire, Evelyn had given him an envelope containing $3 million in bearer bonds and told him to hide it behind her china cabinet in the dining room.
She was in her bedroom, and she hollered at me, and I opened the hallway door. She kind of like hid behind her door, where she always did. She handed them out to me and asked me to hide them in the back of the china cabinet. There were 3 of them. Each one had a $1 million value on it. You would have to lift the china cabinet and move it out from the wall, and it was large and filled with a lot of china, so it was heavy. The only person that knew they were hidden was myself and Evelyn, and I had told Danny about them.
A few weeks after the fire, Danny's attorney petitioned the court to allow them to return to the house and remove personal items. Steve said he could easily see they were missing because the china cabinet had been pulled away from the wall and the outline of the envelope holding $3 million in untraceable bearer bonds was missing. He also says he never told Danny or the police or the family that they were missing.
I don't know about you, but I would have told my best friend and my lover that $3 million in untraceable bonds were missing because I would have been worried the police might have thought that I took them.
It could have been anybody. I mean, somebody pulling the china cabinet out, make sure there's no fires behind it, saw them and took them. Or it could have been Danny who went back in and took them. He would have had to have snuck into the place because it was sealed off as a crime scene, and it was a criminal offense to go in there.
The crime scene was just sealed with yellow tape, so it wouldn't be hard to simply go inside. Steve Wyatt claims this was the first time that he returned to the residence, yet we know from Danny's book and from prior statements from Steve that is not true. The men entered the house the night of the fire.
And this conversation that we've been having was the first time I've ever mentioned the bearer bonds.
Bearer bonds are a bit different than the more common types of investments. See, they were unregistered, meaning whoever brought them or bared them at the bank to cash was the presumptive owner. No name appears on the face of the bond. Obviously, this was extremely high risk. In the early 1980s, they were restricted and outlawed due to their use in criminal activities. It was virtually impossible to recover the value of the bearer bonds if they were lost, stolen, or, say, destroyed in a fire.
If Steve Wyatt saw Evelyn's name printed on those bonds, it can be reasonably assumed they were not bearer bonds, but rather a safer and more conservative type of investment, like a treasury bond, bill, or notes. And $3 million? She might have had $3 million when she inherited the Maybelline stock in the 60s, but by the late 70s, her fortune had substantially dwindled. And remember, $3 million then was like over $20 million in today's market. Danny King himself told the police during questioning that Evelyn was only worth $1.7 million. Almost half of her fortune had disappeared in less than 10 years. Evelyn's granddaughter, Sherry, was also aware of her grandmother's bonds and learned later that the bank had become concerned about who was cashing these bonds out.
She'd become friends with the lady at the bank, and she found out that Danny King was going in there and cashing her bonds. And she knew that was starting to happen. This lady told her that you better do something, Evelyn, because Danny's going in there and cashing your bonds.
It wasn't just the bonds that were missing. Both Danny King and Steve Wyatt admit today to entering Evelyn's home after the fire and taking money that Evelyn had stashed around the house.
After the fire, we went in on the court order. There were a couple of detectives and investigators. I believe Danny was downstairs. He was downstairs getting clothes. And I knew where Evelyn hid money because she would have me hide money for her. So I knew where to look. And I found it, I think about $3,000 in the tips of shoes. She would have shoes, in a rack, where you have a dozen pair of shoes. They were detectives. A lot of times they were standing right by me when I'm going through stuff. I was always amazed that they didn't say anything.
Well, Arkansas Bank and Trust might have been concerned because they sure didn't waste any time opening the estate after the fire. It quite literally was started the next day, and the bank served as the administrator of the estate. One of their first moves was to remove Danny from a management position at the palace. Rick Warren, he vividly remembers meeting with the bank.
They were going to close the theater, and they can thank me that it did not close for good, because I personally went to Arkansas Bank and Trust. Here's this 18-year-old kid coming in to have an executive meeting with the president of the bank. And Mr. Cup had told me that the bank was going to close the theater. And I said, well, Mr. Cup, well, number one, we have all of these thousands of dollars of contracts, and that are legitimate contracts on all of the entertainers, including myself. And I said, all that's going to happen, sir, is there's going to be a multitude of lawsuits. And I said, they will win. He said, what do you suggest? I said, go ahead and honor the contracts that have already been signed. And so he finally agreed that we would keep the theater open, but I was told point blank, you are not to have any contact with Danny King if you want to be paid.
Financially, EvDan, the corporation started by Danny and Evelyn to run the dinner theater, was insolvent with over $50,000 in outstanding debts, plus $115,000 in debt that was advanced from Evelyn's personal accounts to specifically cover the cost of the renovation. In the probate file, we learned the opening night performance with Conway Twitty had a gross profit of $6,000. The estate had to extend a loan just to keep the doors open in hopes of recouping some of the money with the remaining signed contracts with entertainers to fulfill.
It was just a mess. But from the records, we can easily see bills for the renovation. Well, they just weren't getting paid. Instead, that money was gone in the wind. And let's remember, $165,000, that's a huge chunk of change back in 1978. Why, that's like $795,000 in today's money, all spent within a few months.
Meanwhile, as fast as the investigation into the cause of the fire was opened, something odd happened. In the Arkansas State Police file, we find a statement from Sergeant Ray Carnahan with the State Fire Marshal Office.
I've examined the damage caused by the fire at 212 Brown Drive in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and I can explain to my satisfaction all the fires that occurred. All the points of origin and so forth, with the exception of the one small fire in the downstairs area. I could not smell any accelerant material in the area. However, I did secure specimens in this area and submitted them to the crime lab in Little Rock for examination. I'm waiting for the results of the lab report at this time.
Within days, the case was closed at the request of Sergeant Mike Fletcher, the lead investigator with the Arkansas State Police.
It is requested that this case be carried as closed unfounded due to the fact that the material submitted to the state crime lab does not reveal any accelerant or any evidence indicating that a crime has been committed.
Like I said before, at that time, the state crime lab had all kinds of power. If they said there wasn't evidence of a crime, the police investigators would close a case based on what they learned from the crime lab. And at the time, those visual autopsies were missing a lot.
Quickly, the Arkansas State Police ended their investigation, and the local police department officially moved to close the case.
Now, I feel the fire may have been started accidentally because all the lab reports have come back from negative for accelerants. The fact that an aluminum pot with a chicken in it was found on the stove also supports the theory that their fire may have been started accidentally. My department has interviewed 30 to 35 persons, including several who passed polygraph tests. We sent everything we could get out there and her body to the lab. After being viewed at the state forensic lab, the test came back with a report of no incendiary devices. The autopsy report showed she died of smoke inhalation. No foul play was suspected on her body. A blood sample indicated she had a very small amount of tranquilizer in her blood. Therefore, she was not drugged.
So much for those fire experts back then who say lack of accelerants meant no arson. Multiple ignition sources mean everything. A raging inferno and an uncooked chicken made no sense. Where are the 30 to 35 missing interviews? Where are the polygraph results? And most disturbing was the state medical examiner. See, I know a bit about the crime lab. 18 months after this case ended, I was appointed to help clean up the Arkansas State Crime Lab, and I started with the medical examiner section. Dr. Stephen Marks, who had performed this atrocious autopsy, if you can even call it that, had already been fired. In this case and many others at the time, Dr. Stephen Marks did only a visual autopsy. Yep, just a look and see.
Another curious statement was made by Lieutenant Bob Griffith with the Hot Springs Police Department.
Some of the occupants of the house said she had a bad habit of leaving stuff on the stove. I think 2 years ago there was a fire caused by something she left on the stove.
Even Rick Warren, the music director and show producer at the Palace, says he was told she had left food on the stove and there had been a kitchen fire before. Yet this kitchen fire, well, it must have been so minor, the fire department was never called out to the scene. We checked. There's no record of a fire call.
Did Danny come up with a story of a kitchen fire just for the investigation? There's no telling, but what we do know is that by May 12th, all the investigation was over.
The State Police Major Crime Squad is no longer involved in the case, and my department has slowed down our investigation. The case is an open case and is not being closed. We have run out of every lead. There's insufficient evidence to pursue. We're going to keep the case on the open file in case some new evidence is developed. We're not going to pursue it from the level we pursued it in the first 2 or 3 weeks.
While the police investigation was over, the probate on the estate was dragging on, as probate usually does. At the end of April, Danny decided to ditch his Corvette and buy a new sports car, a snazzy 1975 Brecklin. He didn't have cash to make the purchase, so he borrowed from the estate. For $8,000, Danny became the new owner of a Bricklin.
So, Steve, what's a Bricklin?
Well, the Bricklin was an obscure two-seater sports car exported from Canada and manufactured only in 1974 and 1975. The most notable aspect of the car was its gull-wing doors. The cars were hard to miss because 10 years later the DeLorean was manufactured and many of the same features were included. Only 3,000 Brecklins were made and Danny was sporting around in one.
And I gotta wonder if he was wearing the muskrat coat Evelyn bought him right before the fire.
Who knows? Hot Springs went back to normal. The tourists came to town that summer. The palace, under the supervision of the estate trustee, finished up their scheduled guests and closed its doors. Danny went into business with another young man, Roger. They started a modeling and photography business in the small little town. Norman Jones closed his gay bar, Norma Christie's, and headed off to the big city of Little Rock to open the largest discotheque in Arkansas. But Norman never forgot the fire or the Maybelline Queen.
The only thing that I heard, the fire didn't kill her, but she had smoke inhalation. And I said, how did the fire start? He never had an answer for that. He didn't come in for a while, and then he started coming in again. I didn't see him being as much as, before. Used to see him almost every night. Always saying about what he had done for her, or what he had done for her, and she had done for him, and all this good stuff. It was always something big that she had done for him. Everything was just kind of creepy.
Remember, Danny King decided he didn't want to be interviewed for our little podcast, but he did leave us several voice messages on Facebook, and in one, he even mentioned Norman Jones.
Good evening, Tracy. Well, in response to your message about Norman, or Norma Christie, he did not like me at all. We did a photo shoot for him as Norma Christie years ago out at his lake house. When he came the next day up to pay, I said $300, which was nothing. And he just went ballistic. How dare you charge me such an exorbitant amount? I've never liked you, you arrogant. You always come into my bar with your entourage of pretty boys. Some of them even aren't even gay. Rah, 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 just, I was shocked. But because all that time he put on, the big smiles and welcome and all that. And I spent a lot of money and tipped a lot in those days. And I was just taken back. But he just didn't like me because I don't think Norma would really be nice to like me at this point. All right. Good night.
The investigation may have been over, but the story wasn't. Poor Evelyn hadn't even been put to rest, and there was still more drama when it came to Evelyn's funeral. Gloria Rosen told the police the family had made plans.
Danny told me he was planning to have a memorial service for Mrs. Williams. I told him Mr. Williams would definitely not be in favor of such a thing. He was wanting to take her back to California for burial, where her family and friends are. Danny got very indignant, saying people there were asking him about it. I got the feeling he was just trying to promote himself again.
Evelyn would eventually be laid to rest in California, but she didn't rest long.
Evelyn Frances Bossier Williams was cremated and interred with her family at Pacific View Memorial Park in Corona del Mar, California. A few months later, her son was notified that her mausoleum had been breached and her ashes stolen. A Memorial Park representative speculated that they were taken by a local Satanist in the area, but the Williams family believes otherwise.
You know, I was just sitting here and thinking, what's missing with this story? Oh, Satanists, of course. Steve Wyatt recalls a trip Danny made after Evelyn's death to Palm Springs.
Within a couple of months, 2 or 3 months, he had gone out to California for a week with Roger, and they came back, and they began the process of opening up a modeling agency. So I was still with him. I was supposed to go, but I didn't want to go.
Danny and Roger went into business together and started a modeling and photography business in a building owned by Roger's father. He developed photos. In fact, his company developed many of the crime scene photos when I was serving as coroner. Soon, Steve Wyatt's relationship with Danny cooled. Steve was dissatisfied and decided to move back to California, but the men stayed in touch by phone.
And you might be thinking, well, the story's got to be over, right? This concludes the 5th episode in this series. Our team is still actively interviewing witnesses in this case. If you have any information you'd like to share, please reach out to us on our website at coronersreport.net or on Facebook or any social media platform at The Coroner's Report. This case, well, it can still be solved, but we need your help. Feel free to reach out to us, and don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks goes out to all who made this podcast possible, including Evelyn's granddaughter, Sherry Williams, who sat for hours of interviews and provided the voice to her grandmother's words. We'd also like to thank Steve Wyatt, David Hendershot, Norman Jones, Rick Warren, and John Flasterer for allowing us to interview and record their memories and their expertise. Special thanks to voice actors Doug Cryle, Jeff Griffin, Amy Oliver Barnes, Diane Jones, Alan Prather, J.D. West, and Carla Bozeman. Additional information about this story may be found in the following books: The Maybelline Story and the Spirited Family Dynasty Behind It, written by Evelyn's granddaughter, Sherry Williams, and The Maybelline Prince, written by Danae Montague King.